This is the second episode of the Dev Different podcast brought to you by the team here at CodeBuddy. Really excited for the conversation today. We are going to be discussing whether or not you need to buy some out-of-the-box software or you're able to roll your own software, aka build it out yourself. So, team, what are your thoughts? What's the way to approach things?
Well, first of all, we were arguing about this a minute ago off camera about the validity of roll your own as a phrase, and I'm very firmly in the roll your own camp.
Yeah, anytime we can associate ourselves with the tobacco industry, I'm completely
yeah. Well, Devin's like roll out, and it's like just sounds lame. I don't know.
Just
roll your
ludicrous.
own.
I mean, my definition of roll is probably a little more niche than everyone else's, but I think about like foam rolling my legs when I'm sore.
That's true. Yeah.
I roll all the time. It's great.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. Like, when should you do it? When, Devin? So one thing I like to kind of tease Devin and Ross about is having come up in the vanilla web days. They're a little bit older than I am. I kind of missed out on the, the early web HTML, JavaScript, CSS craze. So I'm curious, Devin, having gone through that whole spectrum, because I feel like there's been a shift, right? In that question of like, what is responsible software building? I mean, even like we were just watching the startup.com documentary, and they took $60 million and a year to build like what by today's standards would be a horrible website, and something that you could build in like a weekend, right, as a good developer. So there's certainly been a shift, but what are your thoughts about over time? How has it changed?
I think you had a good point last week, which there was this time where it was very expensive to build software. And so you had all these companies that were building all these low code, no code software tools. We have a lot of customers that use those tools, but what they see is that they run into limitations with those tools. So now is there this trend back to, using generative AI or some of the other tools out there of, all right, you're only going to be credworthy if you've got your own software, or you're only going to be able to be competitive now if you've got something that none of your competitors can do as well.
I was thinking about it recently in terms of clothing, of all things. So I don't know, I've been kind of obsessed recently with clothes that fit. I've lost some weight. I've been kind of adding some muscle, not as much as I'd like, but I've been adding some. And just the idea of rolling around in things that don't actually fit me, but are actually tailored specifically for me. They look a lot nicer. There's that thing. Kind of going out of the box and buying, let's throw HubSpot under the bus, for example, because we use them and they frustrate the heck out of me all the time. They are so big, trying to do everything. It's like the equivalent of me wearing like my grandpa's suit out of the closet that just doesn't fit me. And in terms of like business, it's kind of that ridiculous. Like I'm going out into the world with something that's way too big, baggy. I'm using only a portion of it. And while people may not judge me because they don't see it operationally, I'm just as ineffective by wearing something that is one, a bit out of style. I'll argue that, because a lot of the methodologies that I have to use in HubSpot are out of date with a lot of the ways that AI is working. But also it just doesn't fit me anymore. So actually going out and getting a custom suit or something that's specific for my measurements, for a while there was very cost prohibitive, but now, I don't know, the costs are, it's probably cheaper to do that, right?
Yeah. I think it depends on where your competitive advantage lies too. If you're building something that's outside of software and that's your competitive advantage and you just need software to help support that, that's great. But if your competitive advantage is software or requires some sort of technology, then if all your competitors can do what you're doing and you're just using some, off-the-shelf tool, it's like, well, where's your competitive advantage there? So you almost have to go custom with a lot of these things.
There's that, but I also think that so in the question of, say I have something that I want to build, should I try to go out and buy it or should I build it? I think one of the things is there were a lot of companies, and HubSpot is a really great example, that during an age of software development where it just required bodies and money and time, like they had an advantage, right? Because they could solve the same problems over and over and over again. But their technology is essentially moving around pieces of text and in a structured database way. Like they're really not doing much more than just like organizing very simple pieces of data. And that differs obviously super greatly from somebody like 11 Labs, where their core product is the delivery of these advanced AI models that can synthesize, voice and video from your prompts. Like those are two very different kind of value offerings. And I almost feel that anymore, like if what you're trying to build is in that, it's process orchestration or it's information management, where like, let's be honest, it's just a front end and a database, and you're just, you're creating a data model, you're moving strings around, you're manipulating data, but like, there's nothing really deeply technical going on. Like, I honestly believe, HubSpot's not cheap, right? And software freelancers and freelancers supported by AI or building something with CodeBuddies, we're starting to see we can accomplish applications that, previously dev shops have quoted $200,000 for like $3,000. So, it's hard for me to see that we're not heading to a place where everybody's going to start building their own smaller custom built softwares for even things like internal tools. I don't know. I could be wrong, but
I also see it a little bit of like a progression too. So, if you're early on in your startup and you're just trying to get out there and you're trying to kind of Wizard of Oz everything, it's like use as many existing tools as you can. And then it's like figure out how to replace those over time, swap them out with something that's more custom, that's more, competitive to you. We talked about it in our last episode, like don't try to just jump in and build that full custom thing day one, because you're not going to know exactly what you need to build, and you're not going to, you're going to spend too much money trying to validate it when there's a lot cheaper and there's a lot easier ways to test it out with, existing off the shelf. And then once you start to like figure out, what your niche is, then go custom.
It's almost like I kind of like the suit analogy, Tanner. Like there were and are, I think now still, a lot of online retailers that you can just send your measurements in and they'll ship you, something that's cut to your exact form and shape and exact measurements. But that's a totally different experience than going to, an actual tailor and like sitting with them and them measuring everything, and you're kind of like hanging out, and that's more of like a fully immersed experience. Whereas like, the fact of the matter is there is a abstracted layer of that where you can get something that's pretty close. Maybe the online suit retailer isn't going to give you exactly what you would get from going to the actual like tailor in person, but it's a fraction of the cost and it can get you the majority of the way there that you probably need to prove or disprove, your idea.
Yeah, and I just want to get back on it needing to be right sized for you, because we see that so many times with these platforms where you have to kind of accommodate how they have things set up. And so you're approaching it, these products were often built many years ago using business processes, again, that are not as current within the evolution of business today, especially in the world of AI. And so you're running sales processes or operation processes, HR, all of this stuff along the lines of way things have been done. And I mean, there's a certain way, like good ability to just delegate that because you don't want to think about it. But if you're trying to really push something and make it your own and make your operations as efficient as possible for you, having that ability to make it bespoke for you and only you adds a lot more value than just trying to force yourself into something that doesn't quite fit.
Makes me think too of like Tesla. Tesla has gone down a path of, their philosophy is we manufacture everything in-house that we're capable of doing. And one of the reasons that they do that is because of supply chain, right? So like the more that you have control of in-house, the less that you're vulnerable to decisions made by other companies for their own economic incentives affecting you down the line, right? Like, to put another company on blast, like Webflow, right? Which right now is probably one of the more popular, website CMS hosting projects or products, but they also early on, thought they were going to play in the e-commerce space. And so they rolled out an e-commerce platform that works. You can put products on it and you can take payments and things like that. But they realized that, like, this is not where our money is. I'm sure Shopify is a big giant to compete with. And so they kind of just like left it because they were like, this is not our bread and butter. But then you had thousands of customers, most of them small businesses, that are just kind of stuck in using Webflow for their e-commerce, and they need more features. But because Webflow decided that it wasn't in their economic interest to do that, and because they decided to use these platforms, you're kind of just stuck. I'm curious too, like, what do you guys think? How long and we haven't talked about this, but how long do you think that the Webflows or the Wixes of the world, where it's just, pretty much their value is information and graphics hosted in a website, like, how long do they have a place before, like, it's just going to be cheaper, easier, and better to just use AI to build your own site, like, not like the actual source code?
I think that's tricky. I mean, so we use Webflow, full disclosure, for some of our materials. And, as in my experience, throughout my career, I've used like Wix, Squarespace, Webflow now, obviously like WordPress. We're talking about like OG vanilla web. WordPress is probably one of the originals, that had so much of a community around it. But I think the value with those, still, to maybe answer your question or prompt it a little bit more, is you can get something up and running easily, and maybe AI can kind of help bridge that gap to putting something out there right now. But what is the use case around maintaining that, and how often are you updating content and all that, and building some sort of like they're more of the platform to that CMS, I guess, is still, I think, like,
sure,
AI can't,
like the blogs and
like
stuff like that.
But I mean, that could perhaps change. It just would then become something where, like, you'd have to have a user that is like more comfortable, like, self-hosting all that.
Right.
I think that's kind of like their special sauce, is just like the set it and forget it sort of.
Yeah, I don't think the Webflow or Shopify's are going away, but the Webflows and the Shopify's as we know them are going away.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's probably one of the big differentiators. You have all these companies that are good at a specific task, but they probably will start utilizing a lot more of the generative, customized, easy to interact with via language models. Or if I have a website and I just want to draw it on a napkin, take a picture of it, and have Webflow build it for me, all of those things will probably start changing here very quickly. So maybe Webflow won't be gone, but templates as we know them will be,
right,
or the way you structure them will.
Yeah, I mean,
I think
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, Liquid, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, so you look at Shopify, right? If you want to make a Shopify store look like the way that you want to, you have to learn Shopify's proprietary language called Liquid in order to, which is, it's similar like to HTML and node based things like that, but it's different. It's not the same thing. And like, I know myself, like, I know beyond a shadow of a doubt, granted, I'm a developer, right? But I know that if somebody puts a gun to my head and says, you have to make a Shopify, or you have to make a shopping store that looks like this in some amount of, some fixed amount of time, otherwise I'm going to pull this trigger, I'm going to write the code from scratch. And I'm certainly not going to go and figure out how to do it in Liquid. Mm-hmm. Because like, at some point you're just creating so many layers of abstraction, like, above what is it that we're actually serving our customers. It's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and maybe some WebAssembly stuff. So it's like, I don't know. I'm not saying that they're going to go away, but I think that there's definitely a possibility that these like drag and drop UI editors.
It's interesting, being, like I said, a customer of Webflow ourselves right now, and me primarily handling a lot of that build out. I come from a background of not only design, but like front end dev and, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all that fun stuff. And, to layer even more on that, like more of the vanilla, like, versions of all those instead of, obviously, like there are numerous frameworks and libraries around that make it a lot easier now, and evolutions of those languages. But, the learning curve for Webflow for me was almost, I wouldn't say frustrating is the right word, but there was like a level of annoyance around like, I know how to do this already, but I now have to learn how to do this within this particular product that, to their credit, they make, easier. And I know I'm a little more technical than maybe most of their user base, but, it is that like fine line between like, how should I just like scrap this and just like build it myself really quick? Or does that really quick then become, a little bit longer if I, am omitting all these like cool features that the Webflows of the world can just give you off the shelf. And what is that threshold?
I think we're starting to see disrupted too is, these companies that have these freemium models and then charge these ridiculous amounts for like these added features. We're starting to see a lot of like companies, including ourselves, that are just going and building out these internal tools to replace those features. So we don't have to pay these ridiculous, upcharges of, $3,000-$5,000 for a SaaS, tool or feature that we could just build out ourselves and build out more custom to our specific workflow and our specific business process than having to adapt to, what's already there. We should do a separate podcast on just internal tooling. We've got some really cool stuff. Like we've seen a lot of other companies do some really cool stuff just, outside of what's customer facing, but just tools that their internal, employees can use for both, sales, marketing, business operations, fulfillment, customer success, etc.
I just want to reiterate the point that we are in an inflection point of where it's now easier to build than a lot of times it's easier to buy, because like you're saying, before for internal tooling, for example, to have that done, you would have had to have had a large development team who can, construct it, test it, maintain it, constantly going with all those different nuances. It had to have hosting. Before cloud hosting, you had to have internal servers to actually run things on. But now that we're hitting the point of you can spin something up in the cloud, you can build it using a lot of the different coding methodologies, tools, AIs, all these things very quickly. You don't even have to build one version of it. You can build like many different versions and test out which version actually does fit your operations the best. The friction point isn't the development anymore. It's the actual usage of whatever you build. And that's kind of the big change that we need to, that a lot of people don't quite understand. They still view stuff as like, oh, I'm going to have to do X, I'm going to have to do Y. This is not for me. This is a huge barrier, huge cost. And, not against their fault. There's still a lot of people out there pushing that narrative for their own will because they're selling those types of services, or they have a product like a SaaS product that they're like, oh, this is just going to make your life way easier. But in reality, no, like just strip down it to its essence, what you need done, build it. And then if it doesn't work for you, just scrap it. The costs are minimal.
One thing that's like perhaps flying under the radar that is driving this, move towards it's easier to just build it yourself is NoSQL databases, right? We use Mongo, but like they're, Cassandra, or there's a whole bunch of them. Doesn't really matter which one you use. But now the fact that because that used to be one of the most expensive members of your team, right, was your DBA, like your database administrator, because building a structured database and maintaining indexes and doing everything like that, and then table changes and migrations is just a nightmare, in SQL. But now we have relational, NoSQL databases. You don't even have to tell the database if you're adding a new, table or collection or whatever. You just send it, say store this. And I think so taking that part out of it, where, you used to have $150,000 DBA looking over something if it's of any size. And now it's just your developers can kind of manage it, is huge. And then the other thing is AI, right? With the kind of the general availability of really good AI via API, there's a lot of even very established business model SaaS companies that if you look at their business from like a first principles perspective, you would never build it anymore in the way that they're doing it, So like, for example, if I'm doing lead prospecting, right? And there's a lot of softwares out there that do lead prospecting and have done so deterministically for years. And they're doing all sorts of like weighting, and I'm sure they're doing like a quant approach, right? Where they're doing like as many data points as they can possibly get. Versus now, if you are to build that thing, you have a pile of leads, and then you just ask your customer, like, well, what are you really looking to get? Like, what kind of leads do you want to get? Well, I'm looking for small to mid-sized companies that are demonstrating, interest in whatever industry or have mentioned, this technique or something like that. You just hand that off to a GPT and say, filter this list of leads down to the ones that fit what my customer wants in their own words. And yet it's good. Like it does the job. So
there's just... what? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, like, what's your thoughts, NoSQL versus no relational databases? I know some of these stuff our document databases, we're still kind of doing a lot of you still have to have relationships between the documents and stuff. Where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I've wrestled with it even in our own stuff, right? And I think that the folks at Mongo talk about it a lot. Like it's almost the same way that we're kind of talking about a shift in development mindset. It's almost like you have to undergo a shift in mindset when you go from relational databases to NoSQL. I don't really know the answer. So I can tell you what we do, which is a relational representation in a NoSQL database, which means that we still have collections that come from objects with, they have a firm schema. They all have the same properties essentially, and they have IDs that reference other collections. And I don't see that going away as a useful construct, because the ability to map your business objects to, tables directly or collections of those business objects and be able to query them in a structured way, I think is, still going to stay. And they provide tooling for it too. Like, even though it's NoSQL, they have, schema registry and things like that, where they know that people are going to use these things with structured kind of objects. But it's also nice to just have a junk pile of data too, especially in the days of AI, where you can also have in the same database, you can have your very structured stuff. And then you can also have like, I don't really know what we're going to do with this yet, but it's better to keep it than not, because AI might be able to go through it and extract out some really sick insights. So I think just not having to write upgrade scripts and things and table inserts and things like that, like it's just so much mental load. It's not even that much, but it's like enough that once it's gone, it's like, I'm never going back.
I have a thought kind of around that as well, actually. Not necessarily the database stuff, but just like the idea that the customer doesn't know what they want until you show it to them, sort of a thing. With a lot of these, getting back to just like this off the shelf, like, oh, I know what I need to build, I'm just going to build it, versus that trade-off of, if you do use one of these products that has some sort of like extra layer of, AI generated, whatever bell or whistle that kind of gives you that wow factor, gives you something that you didn't even think that you might need or want, that could fundamentally shift like how you approach, what you build. What is that trade-off? Is that worth, kind of exploring these products that give you some of that extra stuff off the shelf? And is that worth that cost? You know what I'm saying?
I read an article, I don't know, a few weeks ago or something, about how the author was making this prediction that like there's going to be a blue collar software revolution. So basically, like the picture that they painted was that, over the last however many years, there's been a certain number of people that are in software, and they're like, we're going to make our money by building software for companies. And so naturally, who do they build software for? Well, you build to the customer that has the highest ability to pay, which has resulted in like, there's a lot of software for banking, a lot of software for insurance, anything investment, and then like CRM, sales, everything like that. Like it's a much more saturated software market, kind of tailoring to those white collar, industries. But now that each individual developer is able to create more software, better software, they were saying that basically there's a whole bunch of industries. Like I know my brother's in a 2-person company where they fertilize lawns, right, for both residences and commercial buildings. And there's basically like only 2 software offerings for like somebody to manage a business like that. And they use one called Lawn Pro. And my brother called me like a couple months ago and he was like, hey, can you help us figure this out? Like our stuff was like super broken. And then over the next like 5 days, they got emails like from the CEO each day where he was just getting like progressively more and more like kind of frantic about like, we're about to fix it, whatever. And like, you kind of got the sense that, and props to him, like he's got a big business and I think he's just got a few developers. But it just goes to show like lawn care is a big industry, right? Like, I don't know what the MRR or what the total addressable market, is in lawn care, but like, it's not nothing, right? There's a lot of people that do that. And there's only 2 softwares out there to manage these businesses. And one of them is like, they're clearly very like immature, relatively speaking, companies. And so like, basically what the point of the article was is like, as AI gets more and more capable, like it's not that there's no more software to build. It's that there's all these like smaller kind of cottage industries that are really underserved right now in terms of, good software that like you build it, it doesn't cost that much money. It helps them save money. Like the ROI is there, but it's just like there hasn't been the capacity to build to those markets yet.
Well, in the traditional SaaS venture startup world, you had to have that super large total addressable market to get the funding. So you could potentially be that $1 billion unicorn to get things going. And so, yeah, it's perfectly right that all these other markets are completely underserved because they're not worth the time of that SaaS startup, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. But now again, like we're saying, it's a paradigm shift where if it becomes the friction to develop custom software becomes so low and the costs and time become so low, it really is a moment where it is truly accessible to everybody. And at an individual level, you can now have, for whatever specific thing you want, have that built for you.
What would a world look like where a teacher, like an individual classroom teacher, could have a small little app built for the way that they want to, run their classroom in the year? Because every teacher runs things a little bit differently. Like how much more effective could they be and just spend their time teaching kids and not, doing all these other things or whatever. So
another thing that we haven't really talked about is kind of, is it one or the other? And there's also kind of a middle ground too of, we see a lot of these companies that are acting smart enough where they're all having APIs, they're all having webhooks within their own software. So a lot of times you can really, find a software that has something really good for you in it, but then also build your own, extension of it or internal tooling and, connect into that. Working with a lot of clients where they'll use something that meets a lot of their needs, but then they'll need to fire off a webhook to, a different service that's running to do that, or, constantly call in to an API to, check certain data or to, create analytics platforms and visual platforms. So there's definitely that hybrid world that's coming out there too as well, which is pretty cool.
For sure.
All right. So we decided that we're going to have a new segment towards the end of each of these episodes here where we answer questions. So the first podcast episode has had a really great response. So thank you to everybody who's watched that, listened to that, liked, shared, subscribed. Do so on this one if you haven't already. But you can email the team at team@codebuddy.com a question, and we'll try to address those here. So I have a couple questions queued up, kind of on the subject of what we've been talking about. The first question is, how do you balance technical debt with the need for rapid feature development in a startup?
Oh man, this is a great one. I was more on the terms of like, let's just build, build, build. Don't worry about what we're doing. Hunters really helped me realize that periodically, every quarter, what it is, you need to like go in and replace something big that's just slowing you down. That slog is what just kills you as an organization. So yeah, absolutely. Periodically go in and actually replace big technical debt items. We've switched out complete languages, complete database structures, authentication structures.
To riff off that too, it's what are the things that are slowing? There's two pieces of technical debt that you should be really concerned with. What are the things that are slowing you down in your development where you could potentially like 2x or 3x your velocity if that thing wasn't there? And then what are the things that are a threat to your business? Obviously, like if there's a threat vector where your customers could be at risk, and like you got to balance everything, right? But like as a startup, if you let your customers' data get out, that's death, right? But yeah, generally speaking, I tend to err. We don't have very many unit tests, so I don't know. Maybe that's a bygone practice, but
I kind of think it's like anything where, after a certain amount of time, stuff tends to just like pile up. Like maybe this is a totally like off base analogy, but I recently just cleaned out my closet, and it's just like you have so much stuff that you accumulate over the days, months, weeks, years, just from like doing what you do and like living your life and running whatever operations you have going on within your day to day. And at a certain point, you just need to take inventory. And it's almost like you say, or whenever people move. I know Devin recently just moved, so maybe he can even attest to this a little bit more. But like, you just find all these things that you're like, why do I still have this? Like, what is this? What purpose does this serve? And I think there's like at least for me personally, there's like an inner like minimalist where you can start to create, and there's all this sort of like, residual stuff that sort of like sits around because of that. But like, unless you actually take that inventory and sort of like figure out what's serving you and what isn't,
Yeah. Software bloat is like digging through your closet and like, where the fuck are my socks?
Yeah.
You're like, and if you only had your socks and your underwear and whatever things you actually needed in there, you'd be fine. But you got all this other shit in there that's been built up over years that nobody uses. And both from a customer user interaction is horrible, but also when you're going to, build, release, work on new features, it slows you down too as well.
Yeah, I was going to say like, so the original question, Tanner, was how do you balance technical debt with building new features, right? I would almost postulate that it's not a this or that. It's how do I get the most features out the fastest, also knowing that removing technical debt is one of the things that you could do, right? So it's like you should never remove technical debt just for the sake of doing it. You should be doing it because you think it's the best thing to help you get features out faster over the next 3 months, 6 months, 1 year.
It's only if it's holding you back, essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, it was kind of, like your initial point just a minute ago around those two types of technical debt, that those that are slowing you down, if you're carrying around all this debt weight. I mean, so maybe that closet analogy isn't quite as apt, but it's just, the general idea that, you have this clutter or this stuff that is adding more confusion to your development process, that ultimately needs to kind of be checked.
Next question.
All right. How do you go about picking the right tech stack when you're just starting out or launching a new product?
My take on this is use the one with the biggest community until you have a reason not to, and then don't think too hard about it. This like tech stack is one of those things that like every developer has their own opinion and they're all different than everybody else, and like everybody's right in their own situations, but like ultimately I think so. Like React, like I'm not particularly a huge React fan, but like there are big benefits to the fact that React is like super popular and you can look up almost anything that you want and it will like somebody will have fixed it or solved it or made a package for it.
I agree with that. I would say two things. community, and you can find that Stack Overflow does this great like developer survey out there that they survey and see like what are the languages, databases, all tooling that are being used the most. And then the second part to add on to that is also consider like what you're building. Like if you're going heavy AI, like consider, Python, same with like you're doing some machine learning or, visual learning stuff. If you need your app to be like, super, pretty and consumer facing, make sure to, have a really strong front end framework like React, where you're going to have all these just beautiful pre-built component libraries, tools, forms, all this stuff already out there.
I think to a recent consideration, which is kind of mind-blowing actually, is also like, what are the things that the AI systems that you want to use work best with? So like a good example of this is like OpenAI and most of the large language models natively output Markdown is the way that they output like formatted text and information. So it's like, that should also be kind of a part of the consideration. Like, GPT, OpenAI natively understands Python and can like execute Python. So it's like, that's also something to take into account especially if you're new and you're going to be leveraging something like that to help you build.
Well, thanks for everybody to joining to the end. We have some, like I said, great guests lined up, which is pretty cool, as well as more episodes teed up. So make sure you check back, subscribe, and if you have a chance, make sure to 5-star rate, thumbs up, subscribe, all of those types of things too. So we will see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Peace.
Peace.